They said the millionaire's mansion could buy anything except the one sound his son needed most, until a housemaid with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn heart stepped through the iron gate and cracked the silence that money had built. Lucy Campbell arrived with palms damp and pulse racing, a small suitcase thumping her shin as Greenwich's wide streets flared with polished cars and shuttered glances. She had never stood among houses this tall or hedges this clipped. The address on the crumpled slip in her pocket, 221 Carlton Road, Albright Manor, felt like a password to another planet. The gate was black and imposing, its bronze plaque shining with a chill that did not reflect the Sunday light. Cameras watched from the corners, glassy and patient, while the world hummed on the other side. Lucy swallowed, pressed the intercom, and announced herself in a steady, practiced voice. "Lucy Campbell, I am here for the position." A lock clicked with the careful certainty of a judge's gavel. The gate yawned inward, slow and deliberate, as if measuring the worth of her next breath before letting it pass. The drive curved through a garden where nothing grew wild. The grass looked poured rather than planted. The fountain waited with its water switched off, and the mansard roof of the white mansion rose like a frozen wave. No laughter, no footsteps, no trace of a day's clatter lived in the air. There was only a stillness so clean it felt treated. Lucy climbed the broad steps, smoothed her skirt, and reached for the door. It opened before she could knock. He stood tall and narrow as an exclamation point. "I am Orson, the butler," he said, each syllable pressed and ironed. He looked at Lucy the way a steward looks at a trunk, estimating its volume, confirming its label, calculating where to put it so that it does not interfere with more important cargo. "Come." Inside, time lost its footing. The floor shone like a mirror, reflecting a small, determined woman who did not belong in her own reflection. Paintings in gold frames watched from the walls, all stern brows and cool seas. Vases held flowers too perfect to have lived in soil. The smell of cleaning products had the edge of a hospital corridor, the memory of a goodbye. There was a piano under a sheet of white calm. There was silence that did not rest. It pressed. Lucy felt it settle on her shoulders like a command. Orson led her through back corridors where the staff's day ran on narrow tracks. "Breakfast at 6, he recited. Tasks posted by the laundry. No walking the family bedroom halls at night. No entry to family spaces without permission. And most important of all, do not attempt to engage with the boy." The sentence landed like a door shutting in an unlit hallway. Lucy nodded, filed the warning, and said nothing. Her room was small. A narrow bed, a wardrobe that smelled faintly of lavender and starch, a square window facing the laundry yard. She set her suitcase in the corner and sat to breathe, hands gripping her knees. In her head, the list repeated itself like the clicks of a clock: tasks, corridors, no contact with the boy, while another list she did not say aloud beat under it: rent, medicine for her mother, the neighbor Mrs. Martha's morning knock, the price of a bus back to Virginia if this went wrong. She changed into the house uniform and reported to the kitchen. Mrs. Nettie, round-faced and soft-voiced, lifted her eyes from a heap of carrots and gave Lucy a welcome that felt like a blanket. "Do not be afraid, honey," she whispered, as if the walls were listening for every decibel. "This house is cold, but we get by." Lucy chopped in rhythm: vegetables, water, cloth, repeat, while the mansion's silence hung like a clean sheet no one dared wrinkle. At first, she thought she preferred it to noise, but as the minutes gathered, she understood this quiet had a weight. Silence in a home ought to be the pause between notes. Here it felt like the end of a song. Late afternoon, carrying a towel toward the service porch, Lucy stopped. By the pool, a small boy sat with a sketchbook on his lap, head bent, hair falling over his brow. He must have been 10, maybe younger, slim as a reed, a pencil dancing between his fingers with a solemn purpose. The air shifted around him. He looked up. His eyes, dark and searching, met Lucy's. There was no smile and no fear, only a steady curiosity, like a sailor reading the swell of an unfamiliar sea. She offered the smallest nod permission to exist in the same square of air. He held her gaze without moving, then a shadow lengthened behind her. "I have warned you," Orson's voice said from nowhere. "No contact with the boy." Lucy stepped back, heat rising in her throat. She was not trying to break a rule. She would have insisted. But there was something in the boy's eyes, an unspoken thunder so loud she felt she had already heard him. That night, the little bed held her, but sleep did not. The mansion's quiet was not a balm, it was a lid. Lucy lay under it and watched the dim pattern of the window frame on the wall. Somewhere up the front staircase, a picture of a young woman smiled forever with her arms around her son, and a white sheet covered a piano that had nothing to say. Lucy had known, from the listing and the whispered town gossip, that Marian Albright had died in an accident. She had not known grief could reorganize furniture so neatly. Morning came with a tray and a schedule. In the dining room, Richard Albright appeared at last. Lucy glimpsed him from the doorway as she passed with a folded napkin. Tall, well-dressed, a man designed for boardrooms and glass-walled views, he sat at the head of a long table built to host an army and drank his coffee in a silence, even the cutlery respected. He scrolled through his phone, finished, and rose. No one addressed him by his first name. No one addressed him at all. He vanished down the hall like a painting that had learned to walk. In the living room, dust had nothing to do. Lucy wiped shelves that were already clean, and her cloth brushed the edge of a picture frame turned face down. The frame toppled. She caught it, heart lurching, and in that heartbeat she saw the photo it held. Marian and Richard dancing somewhere lit by soft lamps, his smile unguarded, her dress a whisper in motion. She set the frame back, glass to the wall, and noticed for the first time that many frames had been turned like that, faces hidden, memories dismissed, the past tucked away like white linens in a guest room never used. The day found its rhythm, polished surfaces, measured steps, voices the volume of secrets. Every rule felt designed to keep life at bay, and yet life pressed in at the edges. On a garden path, Gabriel Lucy did not yet know his name, but the truth of him hummed sketched the sky with a sun too large for a small page. He drew a heart and stared as if listening for a pulse. Lucy's own heartbeat answered. She wanted to say something, and had no language that would not break a rule. By evening she had learned invisible routes, the corridor where the air felt a degree warmer, the pantry shelf that creaked, the precise twist of wrist required to silence a stubborn hinge. She had learned that when Richard's footsteps measured the hall, everybody's lungs shortened. She had learned that the cook's kindness lived in whispered sentences and extra fruit on a plate, that Orson's power lived in the pause between his words, and that the house itself held its breath between dawn and dusk, as if any exhale might summon what everyone pretended not to remember. Near midnight, footsteps crossed the ceiling above her room, steady and then turning, back and forth, a man dragging a thought up and down a corridor until it wore a groove. Lucy stared at the ceiling and thought of the neighbor in Virginia setting her mother's pills by the sink, of the long bus ride that had brought her to a door that opened without a knock, of a boy who looked at strangers like sailors read waves. She promised herself the same thing she had promised her mother. Do the job well, keep your head down, keep your heart safe. The house did not bargain, it demanded. And yet, with the demand came a pull as strong as tide, a feeling that something essential had been paused here, trapped in a glass case alongside the artificial flowers and the covered piano, waiting for a hand unafraid of fingerprints. Lucy did not plan to be that hand. She planned to last the month. But plans bend where lives ache, and somewhere beyond the master staircase with the turned-down frames and the room with the sheeted instrument, a small boy with a sketchbook was drawing a heart that did not yet know how to beat, and the rules were about to meet the one law a silent house cannot repeal. By the fifth dawn, Lucy knew every sound that wasn't supposed to exist inside that house, the faint sigh of the refrigerator, the clink of a spoon that Mrs. Plain, Nettie accidentally dropped once every morning just to prove she was human, the quiet hum of her own breath echoing too loudly when she dared to feel at ease. Everything else was ruled by silence, an empire of stillness maintained by fear and habit. Yet beneath that quiet, Lucy could sense something living, restless like an animal pacing behind glass. The staff moved like ghosts. Orson appeared and disappeared with precision, his shoes never making a sound. Mrs. Nettie hummed low tunes in the kitchen, but always stopped when footsteps neared. Lucy followed every order, folded every napkin perfectly, and cleaned every glass until she could see her own uncertain reflection in it. But each day, the weight of one rule grew heavier. "Do not get close to the boy." The more she tried to ignore it, the louder it echoed. That afternoon, sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the east corridor, soft but cold, like light that had traveled too far to bring warmth. Lucy was carrying linens when she heard something, a faint tapping. Not the methodical sound of Orson's cane or the rhythmic click of the clock, but irregular, uncertain. She paused and listened. It came again. 3 light taps, a pause, then one. Her heart skipped. She followed the sound past the study, down a short hallway she hadn't explored before. There, through an open door, she saw him. The boy sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, sketchbook open, colored pencils scattered around him like tiny soldiers at rest. He was drawing a bird with spread wings. Its feathers stretched beyond the edges of the paper like it was meant to escape. The afternoon light painted a halo across his hair. For a moment, Lucy forgot the rules. She stepped inside, slow enough not to scare him, but enough to see his face clearly. "Hello," she whispered. Gabriel looked up. His eyes were deep and alert, too knowing for a 10-year-old. He studied her lips moving, then pointed to his ear and shook his head slightly. "Deaf." The word filled Lucy's chest with both pity and awe. She smiled softly, crouched down, and pointed at his drawing, the bird. She traced her finger in the air, mimicking its wings. Gabriel's eyes followed the motion. Then he looked at her again, longer this time, and his lips curved into something between confusion and curiosity. It lasted only seconds. A shadow crossed the doorway. "Orson." "Miss Campbell," his voice snapped, the kind of tone that could strip paint. "You were told to stay away." Lucy froze, her hand midair. No explanation." His eyes didn't blink. "He does not need company. He needs order. Kindly return to your duties." Gabriel flinched slightly at the sound of Orson's voice, though he couldn't hear it. Maybe it was the expression, or maybe silence has ways of carrying anger that words cannot. Lucy stood, murmured a quiet, "I'm sorry," and walked away, her cheeks burning. Behind her, Gabriel picked up his pencil again, but didn't draw. That night, she sat on her narrow bed, staring at the wall. The house's rules were beginning to feel less like discipline and more like chains. She thought of her mother in Virginia, her fragile hands and tired smile, the way she always said, "Sometimes love doesn't ask permission." Lucy wondered what her mother would say about a boy forbidden from being loved simply because it made people uncomfortable. The next morning, the mansion woke as it always did, with precision. 6 o'clock breakfast, 6:30 orders, 7 o'clock chores. Richard Albright descended the stairs, dressed in charcoal gray, his face expressionless. Lucy caught a glimpse of him through the kitchen doorway. He didn't acknowledge anyone. He ate, read his messages, and left. Mrs. Nettie sighed once he was gone. "Poor man," she whispered. "He lost everything that had music." Lucy wanted to ask what that meant, but the older woman only shook her head and returned to slicing bread. Later that day, Lucy was sent to polish the windows in the library. It was a beautiful room, floor-to-ceiling shelves, dustless, with spines that looked untouched for years. As she wiped the glass, her eyes fell on a photograph lying face down on the side table. She hesitated, then lifted it. The woman in the picture smiled from a sunlit garden, Marian Albright. Her beauty was gentle, not sharp. In her arms, the same boy, Gabriel, grinning, alive with sound and motion. The frame's glass was cracked, and behind it, a faint reflection of Lucy's own face overlapped the lost mother's. She set it back carefully, glass to table, and whispered a soft apology, as if the woman could hear. Outside, rain began to fall, thin, steady lines tracing down the windows. The rhythm filled the silence, a kind of music the house couldn't forbid. Lucy thought of Gabriel's drawing of the bird. Maybe he drew wings because he dreamed of a place where noise was allowed, where no one told him that his silence was a problem to be hidden. That evening, while the others ate in the small servant dining area, Lucy stepped outside with a cup of tea. The garden smelled of wet earth and cold metal. Through the drizzle, she saw a small figure by the pool again, Gabriel, sitting alone, sketchbook propped on his knees under the dim garden lights. He wasn't wearing a jacket. His hair stuck to his forehead. He looked impossibly small against the mansion's white bulk behind him. Lucy hesitated. Her pulse quickened. She knew Orson could appear at any second. That one misstep could cost her the job she desperately needed. But the sight of the boy sitting under the rain made something ache inside her. She walked across the patio, slow and silent, until she stood a few feet away. She took off her cardigan and laid it gently over his shoulders. Gabriel blinked, startled, then looked up. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. He glanced at her face, then down at the cardigan, then back at her, eyes wide. She smiled. He didn't smile back, but he didn't move away either. A sudden flash of lightning lit the fountain, the statue of a cherub glistening as if alive. Lucy stepped back, heart hammering. She knew she shouldn't stay. She turned toward the house, but before leaving, she saw Gabriel lift his pencil and sketch something quickly. She couldn't see what it was. Inside, she dried her hair with a towel and tried to steady her breathing. For the first time, she wasn't just nervous about breaking rules. She was afraid of something larger, afraid of how that boy's quiet had found a mirror in her own heart. As she turned off the lamp and lay down, thunder rolled far away. The house creaked faintly, as if adjusting its weight. The silence returned heavier than before, but somewhere inside that silence, Lucy thought she heard it a faint flutter, like the beat of wings against glass. And by morning, something in her would change, something she wouldn't be able to undo. At breakfast, the house looked exactly the same, but something invisible had shifted. The walls still gleamed, the floor still shone, and every clock ticked in obedient rhythm, yet Lucy sensed a quiet tension like the air had begun to listen. Mrs. Nettie noticed it too. She kept glancing toward the hallway where Gabriel usually appeared, though he hadn't yet come down. Richard sat alone at the head of the table, stirring his coffee without drinking it. His movements were slow, precise, but empty of thought. Lucy, carrying a tray of fresh bread, dared to look up. The man looked both powerful and broken, a statue carved from exhaustion. His face didn't show anger, only distance like his body had remained, but his soul had moved elsewhere. When he rose, the chair's legs whispered against the marble, and the room seemed to breathe again. He left without a word, his shoes clicking like punctuation marks in an unfinished sentence. After breakfast, Lucy went about her chores, polishing the brass handles, dusting the staircase rail, arranging the flowers that weren't real. The mansion was beautiful, but it was a beauty that hurt the eyes, so clean it looked untouched by life. When she reached the hallway near the piano, she paused. The white cloth covering it was slightly crooked, and a thin layer of dust clung to the keys visible underneath. Instinctively, she reached out to adjust it. Her fingers brushed one key, just one, and a single note trembled through the room, fragile and fleeting. She froze. The sound disappeared instantly, swallowed by the silence like water into sand. From somewhere behind her, Orson's footsteps approached, steady and warning. "The piano stays covered," he said flatly, not even glancing at her. "Mrs. Albright used to play it. Now it remains as she left it." Lucy nodded quietly, but in that single note, she had heard something no one else in that house wanted to hear, proof that silence could be broken. Later that morning, while sorting laundry, she found a small shirt tucked between folded linens. It was Gabriel's. On the collar, his initials G.A. were stitched in faint thread. She held it a moment, her thumb tracing the faded letters, wondering who had sewn them. Maybe his mother. Maybe it was one of the last things she had done before the world changed. When she went to return the shirt to the playroom, she found Gabriel sitting in the corner again. This time, he was building a puzzle. His thin fingers moved carefully, eyes fixed, lips pressed tight. He placed one piece, then another, but when one didn't fit, he pushed it aside roughly. The frustration on his face was raw. Lucy lingered at the door, unseen. She watched him try again and fail, his small body tightening with effort, until finally he dropped his head into his hands. She wanted to go to him to kneel, to help, but Orson's warning echoed in her mind like a chain pulled taut. So she stood there, silent, her own hands trembling with helplessness. From the corridor, voices murmured Orson on the phone. Lucy couldn't help overhearing a few words through the half-open door. "He isolates himself. Yes, since the accident. Therapy helps little. The master does not want interference." Then a pause. "No, he refuses to sell the piano. It stays as it is." Lucy turned away, heart pounding. "Since the accident." She didn't know what that meant yet, but the words hung heavy in her mind. That night, she opened her small notebook and began to write. The first page already held the words she'd written her first day. "Do not get close to the boy." Beneath it, she added another line. "The house punishes kindness." Her handwriting shook slightly, but writing calmed her. It reminded her she was still herself. Every word she put down was a small rebellion against being erased by the manor's emptiness. Days passed. Lucy did her work with quiet precision, but her thoughts often wandered toward Gabriel. He was always somewhere at the edge of her vision, by the window, in the garden, near the fountain that never ran. Sometimes, when she caught his reflection in the glass, she wondered if he watched her too. One afternoon, she stepped into the garden to hang linens in the pale sunlight. Through the reflection of the window, she saw him sitting under a tree, sketchbook open. She stayed where she was, pretending to adjust the clothespins, but her eyes stayed on him. He was drawing again, this time a figure, a woman. Her outline was rough, uncertain, but familiar. A bun of hair, a loose dress, her head tilted downward. Lucy's breath caught. The woman looked like her. Gabriel's pencil stopped midline, and his head turned slightly, as if he knew she was watching. Their eyes met through the glass, distance and reflection between them. He didn't look away. He simply held her gaze, his expression unreadable, then slowly turned the page and began another drawing. That night, Lucy dreamed of the piano. In her dream, the keys pressed themselves, playing a melody she couldn't recognize, soft, haunting, unfinished. In the background, a woman's laughter echoed faintly, then faded into wind. Lucy woke with her heart racing and her hands damp, the melody still ringing in her mind. The next morning, the mansion was strangely active. Orson moved quickly between rooms, setting up the breakfast table for two. It was the first time Lucy had seen a second plate there. When the master entered, Gabriel walked beside him, his small steps matching his father's longer ones. Richard guided him gently to his seat, then sat opposite. The meal was quiet, more so than usual. The boy didn't eat much. Richard scrolled his phone again, eyes tired. Lucy watched from the doorway, holding a jug of juice. She could feel the invisible wall between father and son, built brick by brick from things left unsaid. Then, for a fraction of a second, Richard looked up. Gabriel was doodling on a napkin, lost in his own world. The father's eyes softened. But before anything could bridge the space, his phone vibrated. The spell broke. He left the table, taking the call, and Gabriel sat alone again. Lucy stood there, torn between obedience and instinct. Then she stepped forward quietly, took the half-finished napkin drawing from the table, and looked at it, a heart. Simple, drawn in 2 lines but broken in the middle. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Outside, the wind was rising, rattling the fountain's dry basin. The air smelled like rain again. Lucy stared up at the mansion's pale facade and thought, there are too many hearts here that have forgotten how to beat. She didn't know that within days, that silence would be shattered not by noise, but by something far more powerful. The 6th morning began with gray skies, and for the first time since she had arrived, Lucy felt the cold bite through her uniform. The mansion seemed to sense the weather too. Its white walls absorbed the gloom, its corridors dimmer, its corners thicker with still air. She carried a bucket and cloth down the back hallway, but her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. The folded napkin with the broken heart still rested in her apron pocket. Each time her hand brushed against it, she felt the weight of meaning it carried, a child's quiet cry drawn in pencil lines. She tried to focus on her chores, but everything reminded her of Gabriel. The fountain, the empty piano room, even the spotless window where his reflection had once lingered. Every detail whispered of something that wanted to live again. Around mid-afternoon, Orson instructed her to clean the old guest room near the library. Lucy obeyed. She swept, dusted, straightened the curtains. As she moved the bed to reach beneath it, something small rolled out, a colored pencil, worn down to its stub, blue. Gabriel's favorite color. She picked it up and held it for a moment, imagining his small hands gripping it, sketching skies that never ended. She didn't realize she was smiling until she heard a soft footstep behind her. Gabriel stood in the doorway, barefoot, sketchbook in one hand, hair messy. He looked hesitant, like he wasn't sure he was supposed to be there, Or maybe like he'd expected her to vanish. Lucy froze, her pulse quickening. She knew this was against the rules, but something about his eyes quiet, pleading disarmed every fear. She knelt slowly, keeping her movements calm. "Hi," she whispered, forgetting he couldn't hear. Then she pointed to the pencil in her hand. His eyes followed. She placed it gently on the floor between them and slid it closer. Gabriel looked down, then crouched, picked it up carefully, and nodded once. His lips didn't move, but his expression said everything. He opened his sketchbook and showed her a drawing. A dog, large ears, tongue out, joy in every line. Lucy let out a small breath of laughter before she could stop herself. She pointed at the drawing, then gave a thumbs up. Gabriel's gaze flickered, his lips twitched a hint of something that might someday become a smile. For the first time, there was no fear in his eyes. The door suddenly creaked. Both turned. Orson stood in the hallway, rigid as a statue, his eyes narrowing at the scene. "Miss Campbell," he said slowly, every word measured. "I believe you've forgotten the rules." Lucy rose, throat tight. "He came here on his own. Enough." Orson's voice dropped an octave. "You are here to work, not to meddle. This house has its reasons you are not entitled to question." Gabriel's face tightened. He clutched his sketchbook to his chest, shrinking slightly behind Lucy. The instinct to protect him came so naturally it scared her. "With respect, sir," she said quietly, "he's just a child." Orson's stare hardened. "He is the master's son, and you will remember your place. Go back to the kitchen." Lucy wanted to argue, to shout that kindness wasn't a crime, but her body refused to move. Her fingers clenched around her apron until her nails bit skin. Finally, she nodded and walked past him, heart hammering. Behind her, she thought she heard Gabriel's pencil hit the floor. The rest of the day passed in suffocating quiet. Mrs. Nettie, sensing something wrong, tried to lighten the air with small talk, but Lucy barely heard her. She washed dishes that were already clean, polished counters that already gleamed. The mansion felt tighter than before, its silence more oppressive, as if Orson's warning had been absorbed into the very walls. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The memory of the boy's eyes, those eyes that had looked at her like she was the first person who saw him, wouldn't let her rest. She turned, shifted, pressed her palms against her forehead. Finally, she got up, pulled her cardigan around her shoulders, and sat by the small window. The garden outside glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Movement caught her eye. A small figure walking along the stone path, sketchbook in hand. Gabriel. Lucy's breath caught. What was he doing awake at this hour? She watched as he sat by the fountain, pencil scratching faintly across paper. Every few seconds, he would glance toward the dark windows of the house, as if afraid of being caught. Then he looked up at the sky, at the moon reflected in the fountain's still water, and drew faster. She wanted to go to him. Every instinct screamed to, but fear of Orson, of losing the job, of crossing a line she could never uncross kept her still. After several minutes, Gabriel closed his notebook, stood, and disappeared behind the hedges. Lucy sat there long after he'd gone, heart heavy. The next morning, she woke early, more tired than when she had lain down. She moved through her chores on autopilot until she reached the laundry room. There, folded neatly on the table, was a small piece of paper. No name, no message, just a drawing, two stick figures, one taller, one smaller, holding hands under a blue sky. Her throat tightened. She didn't need to guess who had left it. That day she made a decision. If she couldn't speak to Gabriel with words, she would speak in ways silence couldn't forbid. During her break, she searched one of the unused back rooms and found an old children's book, its corners frayed, pages faded. The story was simple: a little dog who lost his way and tried to find home again. Lucy wiped the cover clean and tucked it under her apron. That afternoon, she walked to the garden, pretending to take out the trash. Gabriel was there, sketching as always. She sat a few feet away, opened the book, and began turning pages slowly, letting the bright pictures show. She didn't look at him. She just read silently, letting the images speak. Minutes passed. Then she felt his eyes on her. When she turned the page to where the dog got lost, Gabriel shifted closer, his curiosity winning over his caution. Lucy pretended not to notice until his shadow fell across the paper. She pointed to the dog and raised her eyebrows. He nodded. They stayed like that for a long time, two souls in the same quiet, sharing stories without a sound. When the bell from the house chimed 6, Lucy closed the book gently, stood, and dusted off her skirt. She didn't say goodbye, but she smiled. Gabriel did not smile back, but when she walked away, she felt his gaze following her. That night, she slipped the drawing he had left in the laundry under her pillow. For the first time since coming to Albright Manor, she slept without fear. But deep inside, she knew what was coming next. Kindness, in that house, was a dangerous thing, and every moment of warmth she gave the boy was another step toward a storm neither of them could avoid. The morning sun rose late behind a blanket of thin mist, its light pale and uncertain. Lucy stood by the kitchen window peeling apples, her hands moving on instinct while her mind replayed yesterday's secret scene in the garden, the book, the boy's eyes, the quiet understanding that had passed between them. She could not explain it, but she felt lighter. The mansion's silence still weighed on everyone else, but for her it now carried a pulse, one faint heartbeat that belonged to Gabriel. Mrs. Nettie noticed. "You're smiling to yourself, dear," she said softly, sliding a tray of bread into the oven. "That's a rare sight around here." Lucy quickly hid the expression. "Just thinking about home." The older woman gave a knowing look. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it's the people who finally make us feel seen. Before Lucy could answer, the heavy echo of Orson's shoes struck the hallway. He entered without greeting, holding a clipboard tight against his chest. "Mrs. Nettie, Mr. Albright requests coffee in the study. Miss Campbell, accompany me. You are to assist with the silverware." Lucy followed obediently, every step heavier than the last. The study door opened to a world of dark wood and dim light, a faint scent of leather and old smoke. Richard Albright sat behind his desk, suit immaculate, eyes hidden behind unreadable calm. On the shelf behind him, a photo frame faced the wall. Lucy wondered again why every memory in this house seemed afraid of daylight. Orson gestured to the tray. "Here, Miss Campbell." She placed the silver carefully on the low table, feeling Richard's quiet gaze drift toward her and then away again. The silence was so sharp it made her skin prickle. Finally, Orson spoke. "Mr. Albright, if I may, there is a matter regarding the boys' interactions." Lucy froze. Richard looked up from his papers. "Go on." "Miss Campbell has been seen conversing and engaging with Master Gabriel beyond her assigned duties." Richard's eyes shifted to her, not cold, not angry, only tired. "Is that true?" Lucy hesitated. "I only brought him a book, sir. He seemed lonely." Orson's jaw tightened. "It is against the household rules." Richard set his pen down. "Those rules exist for a reason. Gabriel's condition requires stability." He paused, studying her. "But I also know my son doesn't respond easily to people." Lucy met his gaze, heart pounding. "He doesn't respond with words, but he listens, sir, just differently." Richard said nothing. The air thickened with something unspoken, half curiosity, half warning. Finally, he waved his hand slightly. "That will be all." Lucy turned to leave, but Orson's voice followed like a whip. "Miss Campbell, remember where sympathy ends and disobedience begins." She didn't reply. She walked out with her head high, though her chest burned. Outside the door, she paused by the hallway window. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving droplets clinging to the glass. She pressed her fingers lightly against them, thinking how fragile rules felt when measured against the simple need to be kind. By the time afternoon came, she had returned to her duties, but her thoughts were no longer obedient. She cleaned, folded, and polished, but her mind stayed in the garden, with the boy who drew silence into color. At dusk, she carried towels through the courtyard and found Gabriel waiting under the same tree, sketchbook open on his lap. This time he looked up before she could even approach. He tapped the page gently and held it out. The drawing showed a heart wearing a pair of headphones. Lucy blinked, caught between surprise and emotion. Then, slowly, she pointed at herself, hand over her chest. "Here?" she mouthed. Gabriel nodded, a tiny, shy smile flickering across his lips. Something in her broke open a small, bright ache she couldn't name. She crouched beside him, tracing a heart in the air with both hands. Gabriel's eyes followed the movement, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled fully. It wasn't big, but it was real, pure, and contagious. She wanted to laugh, but before she could, the sound of footsteps came from behind. Orson again. He didn't shout this time. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to drain the color from the air. "Inside, both of you." Lucy stood quickly, her cheeks flushed. "He just inside," Orson repeated. Gabriel closed his notebook and clutched it to his chest. Lucy walked beside him, silent. That night in her room, Lucy took the folded napkin and the new drawing and placed them side by side under her pillow. She stared at them until her eyes blurred. Every fiber of her told her to stop, to pull away before it cost her everything. But some part of her, a part she hadn't known, she still had refused. In that mansion where even laughter felt forbidden, Gabriel had smiled. And that, she thought, had to mean something. The next morning she woke early, determined to start before Orson appeared. As she entered the laundry room, she found a small box on the counter, a forgotten guest's gift from months ago, still unopened. Inside were brand new colored pencils. She lifted one, bright red, then another, sea blue, and felt a rush of warmth. When the evening came and her chores were finished, she slipped into the garden again. Gabriel was waiting, as if he had known she'd come. Lucy sat beside him and opened the small bag, revealing the pencils one by one like treasures. His eyes widened, glimmering with excitement. He chose blue first, then red, then yellow. He began to draw. Lucy watched as the page filled with colors. A boy, a dog, and beside them a woman with hair tied back, standing under a tree. He looked up once, as if to confirm she understood. She nodded, smiling through tears she didn't want him to see. They sat until the last light faded, two figures under a gray sky, their silence now alive with color. But somewhere in the manor, Orson was watching. His eyes behind the curtain, cold as the rain about to fall. And Lucy didn't yet know that by the next night, that silence they had turned into warmth would be used against her in the cruelest way. Night came early, draping the mansion in heavy shadows. The lamps burned low, their light barely reaching the ends of the corridors. Lucy had finished polishing the last silver tray when she sensed someone behind her. She turned and found Orson standing by the door, arms crossed, face as unreadable as marble. "We need to speak," he said quietly. His voice didn't need volume to carry authority. "About the boy." Lucy wiped her hands on her apron, already knowing what was coming. "Mr. Orson, I saw you," he cut her off. "In the garden, twice this week. And again this morning when he brought that drawing to the kitchen." He took a slow step closer. "You were warned. This is not about rules for the sake of rules. This is about protecting him and protecting this household from attachment that leads nowhere." Lucy's heart raced. "Attachment?" she echoed. "He's a child, not a threat." Orson's eyes flicked upward. "You think you're helping him, but what happens when you leave? Because you will leave. They all do. And he will be left with another empty space he cannot fill." His tone softened slightly but carried the weight of long habit. "You do not understand this family's pain." Lucy straightened her shoulders. "Maybe not, but I understand what it means to be alone." For a brief second, something almost human passed through his expression, then vanished. "This is your first warning," he said coldly. "There will not be a second." When he was gone, Lucy leaned against the counter, trembling with anger she couldn't show. She wanted to shout, to demand why kindness was treated like a crime. Instead, she folded the dishcloth and finished her work, silent tears falling between breaths. She was still standing there when Gabriel appeared in the doorway, small and quiet, holding a new drawing in his hands. He didn't come in, he simply waited. Lucy forced a smile, though her chest ached. He lifted the paper. It was a heart with two stick figures inside. She nodded, trying to hide the tears. He pointed to his chest, then to hers. She returned the gesture, then mouthed, "Not now." He frowned slightly, confused, but didn't insist. He placed the drawing on the counter and walked away, his bare feet barely making a sound. That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. She lay awake replaying Orson's words. "They all leave." Was that why Gabriel was so quiet, because every sound had been taken from him, and everyone who stayed long enough to care eventually disappeared? She stared at the ceiling until dawn broke through the window like the faintest apology. The next morning, the air in the house was heavy, the kind that warned of rain. Breakfast was silent as always, but the silence felt strained. Richard sat at the table, unreadable, his fingers tapping the cup rhythmically. Lucy noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, the hollowness that came from years of unspoken guilt. When he looked up suddenly, she dropped her gaze, pretending to rearrange the tray. He said nothing, only sipped his coffee and left the room. She spent the rest of the day cleaning the upper hallway. Dust motes floated in beams of light, swirling like ghosts. When she reached the end of the corridor, she noticed one door slightly ajar, the door to a locked guest room. She shouldn't have looked, but curiosity pulled harder than caution. She pushed gently and peeked inside. The room was untouched, a museum of memories. On the dresser sat a silver frame, face down like all the others. Lucy turned it over, and her breath caught. A photograph: Richard and a woman in a pale blue dress, laughing beside a car. Their son between them, much younger, arms raised toward the camera. Life, before it ended. She heard footsteps. Startled, she put the frame back and turned, just as Richard entered. He stopped at the doorway, surprise flickering through his composed mask. For a long second, they said nothing. "You shouldn't be in here," he said softly, but his tone lacked the coldness she'd expected. Lucy lowered her eyes. "I was cleaning, sir." The door was open. He nodded slowly, then looked past her toward the photo. That was the last picture taken before the accident. The word accident hung in the air like smoke. Richard stepped inside, almost speaking to himself. It was raining. We were on the way back from Montauk. She wanted to stop for coffee. I said no. I was late for a call. 5 minutes later, a truck. He stopped, his voice breaking on the memory. "She didn't make it. My son did, but not unchanged." His eyes darkened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. He hasn't heard a sound since that night. Lucy's breath caught. The puzzle pieces of the house finally fit the silence. The locked piano, the fear of attachment. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but Richard turned toward the window, closing the door on his own grief. "Go, Miss Campbell," he said quietly, "before Orson finds you here." She left without another word, her heart heavy with understanding. That evening, she found Gabriel in the living room drawing again. This time it was a car crooked, wheels askew, a small figure inside. He was shaking slightly as he sketched, pressing too hard with the pencil. Lucy sat near the doorway, watching him fight a memory he couldn't express. When the pencil snapped, he froze. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, but she stayed still. The boy pushed the paper aside, stood, and walked upstairs. Later that night, the wind picked up outside, bending the trees until they scraped against the windows. Lucy sat by her window, staring at the pale outline of the garden. Somewhere in the mansion, a piano key echoed softly, a single, hesitant note. She froze, then another. The melody was fractured, uneven, but real. Someone, maybe Richard, was playing for the first time in years. Lucy closed her eyes, listening. The sound wove through the air like a ghost relearning how to breathe. For the first time, silence wasn't the ruler of that house. Sound was returning, one trembling note at a time. But as she listened, she felt a new kind of fear take shape. Not fear of rules, but fear of what would happen when those buried memories fully woke. Because once silence is broken, nothing stays hidden. The next morning felt different, as if the air itself remembered music. The staff moved quieter than usual, not out of fear but confusion, as though something sacred had stirred during the night. Lucy heard whispers in the kitchen. "Mrs." Nettie insisting she'd heard the piano, Orson denying it flatly, saying, "No one in this house plays anymore." Yet the faint echo of those hesitant notes still hummed in Lucy's mind, too real to be a dream. She went about her duties trying to appear composed, but inside she was restless. Somewhere behind those white walls, something had cracked, and she knew it wasn't just Richard's silence. By noon, Gabriel appeared at the bottom of the staircase, holding his sketchbook. He walked slower than usual, eyes flicking toward the piano room. Lucy watched from the dining hall as he hesitated at the doorway, then stepped inside. She followed quietly, her heart racing. The white cloth still covered the instrument, yet the lid seemed slightly shifted, as if touched. Gabriel stood in front of it, staring at the covered keys. Then, without a word, he reached out and lifted the cloth. Dust rose in the morning light like a memory trying to take shape. Lucy froze. The piano was immaculate, every key clean, polished. He pressed one. A soft note filled the air, pure, trembling. Another key. Another note. He could not hear it, yet he smiled faintly, watching the vibrations through the air. Lucy's chest tightened. She stepped forward slowly, afraid to break the spell. She placed her hand on the piano's wooden frame and pressed a key beside his. He looked at her, eyes wide, not with fear but awe. She nodded once, silently encouraging him. Together, they pressed random keys, letting imperfect notes fill the hollow room. Then Richard's reflection appeared in the glass. He stood behind them, motionless, watching. Lucy turned, startled, ready to apologize, but the expression on his face stopped her. He wasn't angry. He was somewhere far away, lost in a memory that had just come alive. His eyes moved from the piano to Gabriel, then to Lucy. For a moment, time held its breath. Then, with deliberate calm, he crossed the room and sat down on the bench. Gabriel stepped back. Richard looked at his hands, then at the keys, and finally began to play. The melody was uneven at first, hesitant, but soon the music grew stronger, flowing through the room in gentle waves. Lucy recognized the emotion before she recognized the song. It was grief, turned into sound, love carved into harmony. Gabriel stood close, his hand on the piano's side, feeling every vibration. His lips parted slightly as if trying to mimic the rhythm. Lucy felt tears rise and didn't fight them. When the song ended, silence returned, but it was no longer cold. It was alive, full, echoing with what had just been said without words. Richard exhaled deeply, his hands trembling above the keys. Then he looked at his son, eyes soft. "She used to play that for you," he said quietly, forgetting for a moment that the boy couldn't hear. Gabriel tilted his head, watching his father's lips, then touched the piano again. A single note answered. Richard smiled faintly. It was the first time Lucy had seen him smile. Later that day, Lucy found a folded paper on the kitchen counter. Gabriel had drawn the piano and beside it 3 figures, 1 man, 1 woman, 1 child. They stood together, surrounded by small notes floating in the air. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling warmth spread through her chest. But Orson found her holding it. His face darkened. "You should not encourage this." She turned toward him, steady this time. "Encourage what? Hope?" "Hope is dangerous," he said flatly. "It wakes things best left asleep." Lucy folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into her pocket. "Then maybe it's time this house woke up." He didn't reply. He just watched her walk away, his jaw tight, his silence louder than any words. That night, Richard summoned her to the study. She expected reprimand, but when she entered, his expression was unreadable. He stood by the window, the moonlight silvering his face. "Gabriel hasn't touched that piano since the accident," he said softly. "You did something I couldn't." Lucy shook her head. "He just needed someone to listen, even if he can't hear." Richard's eyes lifted toward her. "You remind me of her." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Then, quieter, Marion had that same calm defiance, that belief that silence was never the answer. Lucy didn't know what to say. The silence between them was heavy but no longer empty. For the first time they were 2 people, not master and servant. Bound by shared grief they both tried to keep buried. When she left the room, she found Gabriel waiting on the stairs, clutching a blanket and yawning. He pointed toward the piano room, then to his father's study. Lucy nodded, smiling gently. He seemed content, as if he knew something inside the house had shifted. But as she walked back to her small room, Lucy felt an unease she couldn't name. For every light that flickered back to life, a shadow waited quietly nearby. The mansion had been quiet too long, and places that have known such deep silence never break it without consequence. Rain came the next morning, a slow, steady rhythm that softened the sharpness of the mansion's silence. Lucy woke early and moved through the halls with a strange calm. Something had changed. She could feel it in the air, like the house had finally taken its first full breath in years. When she entered the piano room to dust the windowsills, she found the cover folded neatly aside, the bench pulled back. On the floor beneath, tucked halfway under a rug, lay an envelope yellowed, sealed, its edges brittle with time. On the front, written in delicate cursive, were the words, "For Richard." Lucy hesitated. She shouldn't touch it, but the dust had already loosened its grip. She picked it up gently. The handwriting was faint, yet graceful, each curve whispering a name long unspoken. Marian Albright. Her heart raced. She looked toward the door, half expecting Orson to appear, but the hall remained empty. She turned the envelope over in her hands, unsure what to do. The temptation was unbearable. She thought of the piano, of the boy's drawings, of Richard's haunted eyes. Finally, with trembling fingers, she slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, folded twice. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Richard, if you are reading this, it means I did not come home. I need you to remember that our son will not learn to listen with his ears, but with his heart. Promise me you won't let the silence win. Promise me you will teach him that love can still be heard, even when the world goes quiet." Lucy's eyes blurred as she read the final line. "Music is not sound, it's memory, and memory lives in both of you." She folded the letter carefully, her hands shaking, and pressed it against her chest. Then, steadying herself, she walked down the hall to Richard's study. He was there as always, standing by the window, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him. "Mr. Albright," she said softly, "I found something in the piano room." He turned slowly. "What is it?" She hesitated, then handed him the envelope. "It's from her." His breath caught. He took the letter without speaking, his hands trembling before he even opened it. The room was silent except for the faint hiss of rain against the glass as his eyes moved across the page. When he reached the final words, his shoulders slumped. He sat down heavily, staring at nothing. "She wrote this the morning before she left," he whispered, voice breaking. "I thought she was going to visit her sister. She must have known." He couldn't finish. His hand went to his mouth as if to hold back a sound that hadn't escaped in years. Lucy stood quietly nearby, unsure whether to leave or stay. Then Richard looked up, eyes red but alive. "You were right," he said softly. "He listens differently. I never understood that." She shook her head. "You were grieving. You did what you knew." He smiled faintly through tears. "You sound like her." Then he pressed the letter to his chest. This is the first thing she's said to me in 8 years." For a long time, neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled low, like a distant heartbeat. When Lucy finally turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped her. "Miss Campbell," he said, "thank you. For finding it and for giving me back something I thought I'd lost forever." She nodded once and left quietly. As she stepped into the corridor, she saw Gabriel waiting at the top of the stairs, clutching his sketchbook. He tilted his head, sensing the change in the air. Lucy smiled and motioned him down. He came running, stopping at the door to the study. Richard looked up. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other. Then Richard knelt and opened his arms. Gabriel hesitated only a second before stepping forward. The man held his son tightly, closing his eyes as if afraid to let go. Lucy stood back, watching the reunion she hadn't dared imagine. The letter had done what all the rules and silence could not. It had broken the walls between them. Later that night, the house glowed with a strange warmth. The lamps seemed brighter, the rooms less cold. Even Orson, who had always moved like a shadow, spoke in softer tones. Mrs. Nettie hummed again while preparing supper, and when Lucy passed by the piano room, she heard Gabriel tapping a single key over and over, laughing silently at the vibration against his hand. Richard appeared behind her. "He's playing," he said, voice low. Lucy smiled. "He's listening." For a long moment, they stood side by side, watching the boy. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum now breathed with faint, fragile life. Yet deep down, Lucy knew that peace built on emotion in a house like this never lasted long. Somewhere beneath that harmony, the old tension was already stirring again. The more light you bring into a place built on silence, the more the shadows fight to survive, and soon one of those shadows would come for her. The calm lasted only a few days before the storm arrived, wearing perfume and heels. It was a Wednesday afternoon when a black car rolled through the gates, its engine humming low, confident. Lucy was dusting the shelves when she saw the sleek silhouette step out, a woman in her 30s, wrapped in a beige coat, sunglasses perched like armor. She didn't knock. She entered as if the house still belonged to her. "Julia Avery," Orson announced stiffly, though his tone held a flicker of discomfort. Lucy caught the name and froze. She'd seen it once, half-faded on an envelope in Richard's office. The woman looked around with an expression halfway between nostalgia and contempt. "It hasn't changed," she murmured, still as quiet as a tomb. Richard appeared at the top of the stairs, surprise flashing across his face before the old restraint returned. "Julia," he said evenly, walking down. "You should have called." She smiled, slow, practiced, sharp. "Would you have answered?" The tension between them thickened the air. Lucy stood at a distance, watching, invisible but alert. She didn't need to be told who Julia was. The familiarity in Richard's voice, the bitterness under his courtesy said enough. "I heard about the accident anniversary," Julia said lightly, removing her glasses. "Thought you might want company." Richard's jaw tightened. "It's not a social occasion." "No," she said, stepping closer. "But grief gets lonely. And you've always hated being alone." Her gaze slid toward Lucy then, coldly assessing. "And who's this?" Richard turned slightly. "Miss Campbell, the new housemaid." Julia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Pretty for a maid." Lucy lowered her head, cheeks warm. She sensed danger the way animals sense thunder. Julia walked past her, perfume thick as a statement. "You do know people are talking, Richard," she said over her shoulder. "A widower keeping company with his help. It's hardly subtle." Richard's tone sharpened. "There's nothing to talk about." "There never is," Julia murmured, running a manicured finger along the piano's edge. "Until there is." Gabriel appeared then, drawn by the unfamiliar voice. He peeked from behind the doorway, clutching his sketchbook. Julia's expression softened into false sympathy. "Gabriel," she cooed, though she knew he couldn't hear. "My, how you've grown." She reached to touch his hair, but he flinched and stepped back, eyes wary. Julia's smile faltered for an instant, then hardened. "Still afraid of people, I see." Lucy's instinct kicked in. She walked over quietly and placed herself slightly between them, pretending to adjust the vase on the piano. Julia's eyes narrowed. "Protective, are we?" Lucy didn't answer. Richard noticed the exchange and spoke firmly. "That's enough, Julia." Dinner that evening was strained. Julia insisted on staying, claiming she wanted to see how Gabriel was doing. Orson served the meal in silence, his disapproval written in every movement. Lucy poured wine carefully, trying to ignore Julia's constant remarks how the house had become so ordinary, how even the staff looked sentimental these days. Richard kept his tone polite, but Lucy saw his patience thinning. When Julia finally rose, she placed her napkin neatly on the table and turned to Richard. "You're changing, Richard, and not in ways society forgives." Her gaze flicked toward Lucy one last time, venom disguised as charm. "Be careful who you let soften you. Some people mistake pity for love." After she left, the air in the mansion felt bruised. Lucy cleaned the table in silence, her mind spinning. She didn't care about Julia's words. Not really, but she knew how poison worked. It didn't kill outright. It spread slowly until everyone started doubting what they felt. Later that night, as the house settled into uneasy quiet, Richard found Lucy in the hall. "I'm sorry about her," he said softly. "Julia, she was part of another life." Lucy nodded. "She seems like someone who doesn't like being forgotten." He almost smiled. "She doesn't." Then after a pause, "Don't let her bother you." "I won't," Lucy said, though the lie burned her throat. Upstairs, Gabriel couldn't sleep. Lucy heard his small footsteps pacing above her. She climbed the stairs and found him standing by the window, moonlight on his face. He pointed at the driveway where Julia's car had vanished hours ago, then drew a jagged line in the air with his finger, as if describing a storm. Lucy nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "A storm." He looked up at her, eyes uncertain. She smiled gently and touched his shoulder. "It's over now." But she knew it wasn't. Julia's words had sunk their claws into the cracks of the house, and whispers like hers never stayed silent for long. The next time the gates opened, it wouldn't be for a visitor, it would be for trouble. And when that trouble arrived, it would choose Lucy first. The storm Julia left behind didn't break right away. It lingered like humidity in the air, invisible but heavy. For 2 days, the manor returned to its cold rhythm, but something inside Lucy began to shift. She moved through her chores with care, yet she felt watched again, like when she first arrived. The staff whispered softer, Orson's glances grew longer, and even Mrs. Nettie, usually warm, seemed to avoid her eyes. The piano room, once a place of warmth, now felt like a battlefield between memory and suspicion. By the third morning, Richard had locked himself in his study. He'd been like that since Julia's visit: curt phone calls, unopened meals, the smell of whiskey faint in the hall. Lucy wanted to believe it was work, but she'd seen this silence before. It was the silence that came after guilt. When she knocked gently, no answer came, only the echo of a man trying to keep control. That afternoon, she found Gabriel sitting by the garden pond, sketching with a broken blue pencil. His drawings were darker now: clouds, waves, walls, always walls. When she crouched beside him, he pushed the page toward her. It was the house, but unlike his usual careful lines, this one looked cracked, as if splitting down the middle. In the center, he'd drawn 3 small figures: hers, his, and his father's. But one stood outside the line. Lucy looked at him softly. "You think I'll leave?" she asked, though he couldn't hear. He didn't look up, just nodded slowly. Her throat tightened. That evening, Richard appeared at dinner, pale but composed. "Julia has been talking," he said quietly to Orson. "I received 2 calls today, people asking about the housemaid and my son." Orson's lips tightened, and he said what Lucy feared. "It would be wiser to distance, sir, for appearances." Richard looked down. Lucy didn't speak, but the air between them fractured. The very thing she'd brought back into their lives, human warmth, was now being treated like a threat. Later, in the laundry, Lucy tried to fold linens, but her hands trembled. Mrs. Nettie appeared with a soft sigh. "Girl, don't let gossip chase you out. This house has been dead too long. You brought breath into it." Lucy smiled faintly. Sometimes breath isn't enough when people prefer ghosts. That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. She walked through the empty halls barefoot, the old wooden floors creaking under her steps. The house had a way of remembering pain. It held on to every whisper, every fight, every loss. She paused by the piano room. Moonlight spilled through the windows, silvering the keys. She sat on the bench and pressed a single note. It echoed through the silence like a heartbeat. "Couldn't sleep either?" Richard's voice came from the doorway. She turned, startled. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, eyes tired. "This place was never meant for peace," he said quietly. "My wife used to say a house becomes what you feed it. I fed this one grief for years." Lucy turned back to the keys. "Maybe it's time to feed it something else." He studied her face a moment, as if searching for an answer he didn't deserve. "You've changed things here, Lucy. For me, for Gabriel." He hesitated, then looked away. "But people like Julia, they twist kindness into scandal." Lucy's voice was steady. "People always will, but what they say doesn't make it less real." He nodded slowly. "You sound like her." Lucy smiled faintly. "Maybe I just believe in what she wrote." He blinked. "What she wrote?" "The letter," she said softly. "She told you not to let silence win." Richard exhaled, sitting beside her. For a moment there was no hierarchy, no wall, just 2 broken people sharing a piano bench. His hand brushed the edge of the keys. "Do you ever regret coming here?" he asked. Lucy thought for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes, but not for the reasons you think. I regret not coming sooner." He looked at her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Then, in a voice almost too quiet to catch, he said, "If I asked you to stay, would you?" She didn't turn. "Would you mean it?" He froze. Silence filled the room again, not the painful kind, but one that trembled with something unsaid. The next morning, Lucy found a letter on her pillow. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "Lucy, thank you for everything you've done for Gabriel, for me, but you don't owe this house anything. It owes you peace. R. She folded it slowly, breath shaking. It wasn't dismissal, but it felt close. At breakfast, Richard avoided her eyes. Gabriel barely ate. The piano stayed closed. By midday, the wind outside turned restless, pushing against the windows. Lucy took it as a sign. She went upstairs and began to pack her few things. When she came down with her small suitcase, Mrs. Nettie was waiting by the stairs. "You're leaving?" Lucy nodded. "Before someone else decides for me." "Child," the woman whispered, tears forming. "You fixed what money couldn't." Lucy smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's enough." She turned toward the door. The house seemed to hold its breath again, as if it knew what was about to happen. She touched the piano one last time, her fingertips grazing the cold ivory. Behind her, the floor creaked. Richard standing there, eyes dark, unreadable. "Leaving without goodbye?" he asked. Lucy swallowed. "I already said it. You just haven't read it yet." He took a slow step closer. "If you go, everything goes quiet again." Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "Then make noise, Richard. For him. For yourself." She turned, opened the door, and stepped into the rain. Behind her, Gabriel stood at the top of the stairs, clutching his sketchbook, eyes wide and wet. His mouth opened in silence, but the sound that didn't come from him still echoed in every corner of the manor, the sound of losing something irreplaceable. And as Lucy disappeared through the gate, Richard whispered into the empty air, "Don't let the silence win." Rain swept the streets in thick sheets as Lucy walked toward the bus stop, her suitcase heavy in one hand, her heart heavier in the other. The sky was pale gray, the kind that looked endless, swallowing sound and distance. She didn't cry. Tears felt too small for the ache spreading inside her. Every step away from the manor felt like leaving behind a piece of herself, every echo of thunder like the sound of something closing for good. When she reached the station, the bench was cold, the air damp with memory. She sat, gripping the ticket she hadn't even looked at, wondering how something that never should have happened had somehow become her whole life. Back at Albright Manor, the emptiness was instant. Mrs. Nettie moved slower, her humming gone. The air grew still, too clean, too orderly. Even the lights seemed dimmer, as though they refused to shine without her warmth. Orson's routine continued as before, but when he passed the piano room, he caught himself pausing, glancing at the closed lid before looking away too fast. Upstairs, Richard sat at the table with the note Lucy had left. Her handwriting was neat, but trembling. "You and Gabriel are stronger than you think. You don't need me to heal, only each other. Please remember what she wrote. Don't let silence win." The words blurred as he read them again. He folded the paper, set it beside his untouched coffee, and pressed his hands against his face. He had let her go, just like he had let Marion go, just like he'd let every sound in his life fade into the walls of that house. Upstairs, a door slammed. Gabriel. Richard's heart sank. He stood and went up, calling the boy's name, though he knew it was useless. In the hallway, Gabriel was already packing his small backpack, pencils, papers, the first drawing he and Lucy made together, the one with the heart and the headphones. He zipped it shut and looked at his father, eyes blazing with a pain far older than his years. Richard knelt, trying to meet his gaze, trying to sign, but his hands trembled. "She left because of me," he wanted to say. "But I'll fix it." Gabriel shook his head violently, shoved the backpack over his shoulder, and ran past him before Richard could react. Down the stairs, through the hall, to the front door. "Gabriel!" he shouted, running after him, barefoot, heart hammering. The boy tore the door open and sprinted into the rain. The world outside blurred into gray. Cars hissed by, puddles splashed, but all Richard saw was that small figure darting across the street, drenched, wild, determined. He jumped into the car, engine roaring, tires slipping on wet pavement. Fear pulsed through every nerve. He knew where the boy was going. The station, the only place Lucy could be. Gabriel ran until his lungs burned. His shoes were soaked, his sketchbook clutched against his chest. He didn't know directions, only feelings. The station had meant arrival once, now it meant escape. He reached the platform trembling, dripping water, his breath shallow. He looked around frantically, scanning every face that passed, strangers with umbrellas, suitcases, damp coats, but not hers. He sat on a bench, pulled out a pencil, and began to draw. The outline of a woman with a suitcase. Beside her, a dotted line that ended halfway. He couldn't finish it. Minutes later, headlights swept across the station wall. Richard's car skidded to a stop outside. He ran inside, soaked to the bone, eyes wild until he saw the boy on the bench. Relief and guilt crashed together in his chest. He slowed his steps, afraid of scaring him. Gabriel didn't look up, still drawing. Richard knelt beside him, breathing hard. The boy turned the sketchbook around. It was her. Lucy, walking away beneath the rain, her hand waving goodbye. Richard's voice broke. "I know," he whispered. Gabriel stared, eyes glassy. Then he wrote on the page, pressing the pencil so hard it tore the paper. "You let her go." Richard's chest caved in. He couldn't deny it. "I did," he said softly, the words trembling in the air. "And I won't again." He stood, hand outstretched. Gabriel hesitated, then took it. Together, they walked to the car. The drive was long and wordless, the wipers scraping rhythmically as the highway stretched before them. Every mile felt like a confession Richard couldn't say out loud. He gripped the wheel, eyes locked ahead, mind replaying every moment Lucy's patience, her courage, her laughter and silence. She had been the sound he hadn't realized he needed. 2 hours later, the car climbed through the foothills, where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. A small town appeared, its lights faint against the mist. Lucy's mother's address was written in trembling handwriting on a folded note in his pocket. He'd found it months ago in her job application, never meaning to use it. Now it was all he had. He parked outside a modest white house with a rusted gate and wildflowers growing along the fence. The porch light glowed weakly in the rain. He sat for a moment, staring at it, afraid to move. Gabriel stirred beside him, clutching his sketchbook. Richard finally opened the door and stepped out. The rain soaked him instantly, but he didn't care. He walked to the door and knocked once, twice. It opened slowly. An older woman with gentle eyes stood there, wrapped in a shawl. She recognized him instantly. Wealth and sorrow were unmistakable things. She didn't speak, only nodded once, and turned to call inside. Footsteps approached. Lucy appeared in the doorway. Her hair was damp, her sleeves rolled, her face still marked by exhaustion. For a moment, she froze. Then her eyes widened, disbelief flickering into 1,000 emotions at once. "Hi, Lucy," Richard said softly. She didn't move. The sound of his voice in that small, quiet porch made the world feel suddenly smaller. "Why are you here?" she asked. He swallowed. "Because I was wrong to let you leave, and because there's someone else who couldn't bear to lose you either." Gabriel stepped forward from behind him, holding up his sketchbook like a message. The drawing on the page showed 3 figures under a tree together again. Rainwater streaked the pencil lines, blurring them like tears. Lucy's hand flew to her mouth. She knelt, gathering the boy into her arms, holding him so tight it hurt. Richard stood in the doorway, drenched, motionless, watching. It was the first time in years he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. When Lucy finally looked up, her eyes were filled with the kind of forgiveness that doesn't need words. "You both came all this way," she whispered. Richard nodded. "We came home." But in that moment, none of them realized that coming home was only the beginning, and the hardest part was still ahead. Morning came soft and blue over the mountains. Mist clung to the grass and the porch smelled of wet wood and coffee. Lucy woke early, her heart still unsteady from the night before. The sound of small feet in the kitchen made her smile. Gabriel was already up, tracing shapes in the condensation on the window. When she entered, he looked up, eyes bright, no longer haunted. Richard stood behind him, awkward in the small space, holding a cup too delicate for his large hands. The sight of him in her mother's kitchen felt unreal, like something out of a dream that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to last. He spoke softly. "He woke me before sunrise, said he wanted to draw you." Lucy glanced at the table. There lay a simple sketch, 3 stick figures and a small house with smoke curling from the roof. Beneath it, Gabriel had written in big, uneven letters, "Home." She traced the word with her finger, whispering, "Yes, home." After breakfast, Richard walked outside to the old fence. His expensive shoes sank slightly into the damp soil. He looked out toward the hills where clouds brushed the treetops, the kind of view money couldn't buy. Lucy joined him quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy, just full. Finally, he said, "When Marion died, I thought the world ended. When you left, I realized it just stopped making sense." His voice cracked on the last word. Lucy turned to him, calm but firm. "Maybe it's not supposed to make sense, Richard. Maybe it's supposed to be felt." He nodded, eyes distant. "You gave that back to us. I thought money could fix things. Turns out it can't even buy a heartbeat." Inside, Gabriel stood at the window, watching them through the fogged glass. He pressed his palm to the glass pane, leaving a faint print that looked like a promise. Lucy saw it, smiled softly, and whispered, "He's waiting." They walked back together, no more words needed. Ruth, Lucy's mother, poured more coffee, eyes kind but sharp. She studied Richard quietly, then said, "You look like a man who hasn't slept in years." Richard gave a small, respectful smile. "Until recently, that was true." Ruth tilted her head. "Then maybe you're in the right place, but be careful. My daughter doesn't fall halfway. She either gives all of herself or nothing." Lucy blushed slightly, but Richard's expression was steady. "Then I'll have to deserve all of it." The older woman nodded, satisfied. The day unfolded simply. They ate, talked in fragments, repaired what was broken, not through words but through gestures, passing salt, washing dishes together, watching Gabriel chase a stray dog in the yard. The rhythm was slow, human, the kind that healed without asking permission. At dusk, Lucy sat with Gabriel on the steps, brushing his damp hair. Richard came out, leaning against the doorframe. "We should go back tomorrow," he said carefully. Lucy froze for a second, then looked up. "Back?" "Yes," he said. "To the house. To start again. With you." Her heart skipped. She searched his face for hesitation but saw only sincerity. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You know what people will say." He shrugged. "Let them talk. For the first time, I don't care." She laughed quietly, half from relief, half disbelief. "Then we'll go together." The next afternoon they drove back toward Greenwich. The road curved through valleys and small towns before opening into the wide, quiet suburbs. Gabriel sat in the back seat, head resting against the window, holding his sketchbook. Lucy's hand rested lightly on Richard's arm as he drove. The manor came into view, white walls gleaming faintly under the overcast sky. The gates opened slowly, as if the house itself hesitated. Inside, everything looked unchanged, the same garden, the same walls, but the air felt new. When they stepped inside, Mrs. Nettie gasped and covered her mouth. "Child, you came back!" she cried, eyes wet. Even Orson blinked twice before lowering his gaze. Richard looked around, then said clearly, "Nothing in this house will go back to how it was." He turned to Lucy. "From now on, you're not staff. You're family." Silence followed. For once, even Orson didn't argue. Gabriel walked up to the piano, lifted the cover, and touched the keys gently. Richard joined him, placing his hand beside his son's. The melody rose slowly, familiar and warm, the same song Marion had played years before. Lucy stood by the door, her eyes shining, watching as father and son played together, no sound needed, only feeling. When they finished, Gabriel turned and ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Richard looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no need for vows or promises. Everything was already said in the way they looked at each other. That night, as rain began again outside, the house glowed with soft light. The piano stood uncovered, its notes still echoing faintly through the halls. Lucy sat beside Gabriel's bed, brushing his hair from his forehead as he fell asleep. In the next room, Richard stood at the window, watching the storm. The reflection in the glass showed not the man he'd been, but the man he'd finally become, one who listened, one who felt, one who stayed. When Lucy joined him, he turned, voice low. "You brought sound back to a deaf house." She smiled. "No, Richard, you did. You just needed someone to remind you how." He took her hand gently. "Then don't remind me just once. Stay." She looked up at him, rain streaking the window behind. "I already am." Outside, thunder rolled softly, but inside the manor, silence had changed. It no longer suffocated. It waited, breathing, alive. And for the first time since tragedy had stolen everything, the Albright house was no longer just standing, it was living. The following morning unfolded with a light unlike any the manor had seen in years. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, scattering over the polished floor and reflecting off the piano's uncovered lid. It was the kind of morning that didn't demand words, just presence. Richard woke before dawn, not from nightmares this time, but from peace. He stood by the window of his bedroom, watching Gabriel run barefoot through the dewy grass, his small figure a moving piece of color against the white stone of the house. Lucy's laughter carried faintly from the garden, soft but clear, weaving into the air like music. He hadn't realized until then how much the sound of joy had been missing. When he came downstairs, breakfast was already on the table. No servants, no formality, just 3 plates, a warm loaf of bread, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Lucy stood by the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair messy in a way that made her look real, grounded. "Morning," she said, smiling. "You look different." He raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Alive," she replied simply. The word hit deeper than she meant it to. He sat, poured his coffee, and for once didn't check his phone. Across the table, Gabriel was drawing, a steady hand tracing a picture of the piano again, but this time the room in the drawing wasn't empty. 3 figures stood beside it. After breakfast, they walked together through the garden. The air smelled of wet leaves and early roses. Richard spoke quietly. "You know, I used to think that house was cursed, that losing Marion made it unlivable." Lucy glanced at him. "Maybe it wasn't cursed. Maybe it was just waiting for the right sound." He nodded. "And you brought it back." "No," she said softly. "Gabriel did. I just listened." He smiled at that, not answering, but his expression said everything: gratitude, affection, something growing that neither dared to name yet. The next few days passed in a rhythm both ordinary and extraordinary. Lucy helped Mrs. Nettie reopen the old kitchen garden. Gabriel began to laugh more often, silently but fully, his whole face lighting up when the dog from next door wandered in. Richard returned to work, but not the same way. His colleagues noticed a difference. He no longer filled silences with control. He allowed space, allowed pause. Even the house staff moved easier now, as though the very air had grown lighter. One evening, Richard called Lucy and Gabriel into the main room. The piano sat gleaming beneath the chandelier. On top of it was a folder of papers. "What's this?" Lucy asked. "Something long overdue," Richard said, opening it. Inside were documents his will, newly rewritten. "I wanted it to be official," he said. "The manor, the Miami property, the trust, it's all in Gabriel's name. And you," he looked at Lucy, "are his guardian if anything ever happens to me." Lucy froze, her breath catching. "Richard, you don't have to." "I do," he interrupted gently. "You didn't save just him, Lucy. You saved me." Her eyes glistened. For a moment she couldn't speak, only nod, her throat tight with emotion. That night, after Gabriel fell asleep, she found Richard sitting at the piano, the light from a single lamp casting long shadows. He was playing softly, a melody half-finished, his fingers uncertain but heartfelt. She stood by the doorway, watching. "I thought you didn't play without him," she said quietly. "I don't," he replied, not looking up. "But tonight feels different, like the walls are listening again." She moved closer and leaned against the piano. "They're not the only ones." He smiled faintly, playing another note. "You know, when I was young, my father used to say silence is power, but I think he was wrong. Silence is only power when someone dares to break it." Lucy sat beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't stop breaking it." He turned to her then, eyes tired but alive. "I won't if you stay." The simplicity of the words left no room for doubt. She nodded slowly, her hand resting over his on the keys. Together they pressed one final chord. It hung in the air long, full, alive. Weeks passed, the seasons shifting gently around them. Gabriel began lessons again, this time with a teacher who specialized in visual rhythm music for the deaf, felt through vibration and color. His drawings changed too. They were brighter now. Suns, trees, laughter drawn as swirls of light. Lucy kept each one carefully, storing them like small miracles. One evening as summer drew near, Richard brought out a surprise, a ticket to Miami. "The ocean," he said, smiling. "I think it's time Gabriel learned that waves can sing too." Lucy laughed. "You're serious?" "Completely. What about the house?" "It stood silent for years. It can wait a few weeks." And so they went. The Miami air was warm, the salt thick in the breeze, the sea stretched endlessly, the horizon blurring into gold. Their new house was smaller but full of light books, laughter, Gabriel's drawings taped on the fridge. It wasn't wealth that defined it, it was presence. The sound of pages turning, pencils scratching, the piano they'd brought with them echoing through open windows. Every corner spoke of second chances. One night, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the tide roll in, Gabriel signed a simple phrase he had learned from Lucy's lessons. "Thank you." Richard signed back. "For what?" The boy smiled and signed again. "For listening." Lucy leaned her head on Richard's shoulder, the wind threading through their hair. The world had gone quiet again, but this silence was no longer empty. It was alive, filled with the hum of hearts, finally at peace. The following months slipped by like pages of a book that everyone feared to finish. The house in Miami stood by the sea, its white walls shimmering under the sunlight, its windows always open to the sound of waves. Every morning began with the same ritual. Gabriel running barefoot through the sand, sketchbook tucked under his arm, Lucy sitting on the porch steps with her coffee, and Richard watching them both as the sky brightened from gold to blue. It was the kind of peace he never believed he'd live long enough to see. Yet peace, Richard had learned, was not the absence of pain. It was learning to live beside it. He worked less now. His empire, once the center of his existence, had shrunk to what truly mattered: a handful of projects, his son's laughter, the woman who had brought sound back into their world. Lucy, who had come to the Albright estate as a servant, now walked beside him as an equal. She had her own life, her own choices, and yet she stayed. Sometimes she still looked out to sea, silent, as though speaking with ghosts no one else could see. Richard never asked what she said to them. He simply sat beside her until she smiled again. Gabriel thrived in this new world of color and rhythm. He attended classes twice a week with a local teacher who used sand vibrations to teach deaf children how to feel music. He would come home with sand still clinging to his hands, proud and glowing, showing Lucy every new pattern he had discovered. In the evenings, the three of them played small games, piano keys turned into colors, rhythms into drawings. The boy had found his way to listen, just as Marion had asked. But on quiet nights, when the moon rose high and silver, Richard sometimes felt the weight of memory return. He would step outside, the sea breeze sharp against his skin, and think of the road that had led here, the years of guilt, the silence, the woman who had refused to let it consume them. Lucy would always find him there, standing by the railing, staring at the dark horizon. "You're thinking again," she'd say gently. "Always," he'd reply. "Old habits die slow." "Then let's make new ones," she'd whisper, her hand slipping into his. He would smile at that. One evening, they decided to hold a small gathering, just Mrs. Nettie, Orson, and a few close friends who had remained loyal through the years. The old butler, gray and stiff, arrived first. He looked older, softer even, as if the house's transformation had touched him too. "Sir," he said to Richard, voice gentler than before, "I must confess, when she first came, I thought she'd break this family. Instead, she rebuilt it." Richard's expression warmed. "No, Orson," he said, "she rebuilt me." Orson nodded, eyes glistening. As the evening faded, Gabriel insisted on playing something on the piano. He had practiced for weeks a simple melody, slow but steady. He couldn't hear the notes, but he could feel every vibration. When he finished, everyone stood in silence, moved not by perfection but by courage. Richard felt tears sting his eyes. Lucy reached for his hand under the table, squeezing once. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Gabriel had fallen asleep, Lucy and Richard walked to the shore. The moonlight stretched across the water like silver cloth. She turned to him and said quietly, "You kept your promise." He frowned gently. "Which one?" "You didn't let silence win." Richard looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," he said softly. "You didn't let me." The tide crept higher, brushing against their feet, cool and steady. Lucy leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. The world was quiet, but it was a living quiet, a silence full of heartbeat and wind, of water and memory. For a long time, they stood there, the three shadows of their lives, Marion, Lucy, and Richard, somehow coexisting in the same breath of sea air. As dawn approached, the first hint of light touched the waves. Gabriel stirred in his room, dreaming of sound. The ocean whispered, the same whisper that had followed them since that cold house in Greenwich. "Listen with your heart." Richard closed his eyes, listening. The world answered back not with words, but with everything that mattered. The years that followed were quiet, but never empty. The ocean became their calendar, its tides marking the rhythm of their lives. Seasons passed in waves of sunlight and rain, and with each one, the house grew warmer, fuller, alive. The once cold Albright estate was sold, its walls finally freed from the weight of ghosts. In its place stood a home that breathed open, bright, filled with color and laughter. Gabriel grew into a young man with steady hands and a patient soul. He never recovered his hearing, but he no longer needed to. He learned to compose music through touch-mapping vibrations, feeling frequencies through his fingertips, building melodies out of silence. His first performance at a local gallery left the crowd speechless, a silent symphony of light and shadow, played on a piano that glowed with faint blue light. When the last vibration faded, people didn't clap. They simply stood, listening to the echo of feeling he had created. Lucy watched from the front row, her heart swelling with a pride too deep for words. Beside her, Richard sat upright, his eyes shining, his hand gripping hers tightly. He leaned close and whispered, "She'd be proud of him." Lucy turned and smiled. "She'd be proud of you." He shook his head. "No, of us." After that evening, Gabriel's art gained quiet attention: articles, interviews, invitations from music schools, curious about his technique. But he always refused to leave Miami. "The sea is my sound," he told them through signs. "Everything I need is here." He still kept the old sketchbook, now weathered and full of drawings from his childhood. The cracked house, the heart with headphones, the three figures standing under a tree. He had added one more page, a single line that read, "Silence is not the absence of sound, it's where love begins to speak." As for Richard and Lucy, they aged not with regret, but with gratitude. Their love never sought drama, it existed quietly, built on shared mornings, gentle arguments, and the daily act of staying. He found peace in her steadiness, she found purpose in his rediscovered kindness. They still visited Marion's resting place once a year. Gabriel always came too, placing one of his sketches by her name, a symbol of the music she had left behind. Each year, Richard would whisper the same words. "You were right, my love." He learned to listen with his heart. In time, the sea began to take the edges of their youth, softening them the way it softens stones. Lucy's hair turned silver, Richard's steps slowed, but their laughter never faded. Even when words failed them, silence between them still spoke with the ease of years. One night, near sunset, they sat on the porch as Gabriel played softly inside. The melody wasn't meant for anyone but them, a sound that could be felt through the wooden boards beneath their feet. Lucy rested her head on Richard's shoulder. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "No. I think about what came before and how it brought me here." She took his hand, their fingers interlacing like the meeting of two stories that had run too far alone before finally finding each other. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the air turned golden. The waves rolled in, steady, eternal. Gabriel's music faded, leaving only the pulse of the sea. Richard exhaled, his voice barely a whisper. "Listen," he said. Lucy closed her eyes, smiling. "I am." The world around them fell into stillness, but it wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of peace, of love that no longer needed sound to exist. The same silence that had once broken them now held them whole. In the end, it wasn't tragedy that defined them, but the courage to keep listening long after the music stopped. And as the tide rose under the moonlight, the sea carried their story into the night, a song without sound, but one the heart could never forget.